till 6, Simon Owens.
I always get nervous when I am talking to people I have great admiration for, and that certainly is the case today. I am blessed to be on the phone speaking to Ron Blaskett. Mr. Blaskett, Ron, how are you?
I'm very good, and when I hear your voice, memories come flooding back of the wonderful time I had with your uncle, who was the first face on Victorian television and such a genial and lovely man.
Oh, that's lovely of you to say so. I'm very pleased to be even mentioned in the same breath as Uncle Jeff.
Yeah, he was something very special.
And on Uncle Jeff, or Jeff Cork, as the listeners would know him, you're actually the one who crowned him Corky King of the Kids.
I was at the club having dinner one Sunday night with Bernard the Magician, and I realised that he needed some sort of personality for the children, and the thing came to me, King Corky, King of the Kids, and it worked and it gelled and it suited his physique and his personality, and he was the most successful children's compere that we had, although the role embarrassed him slightly because he'd been high profile with Graham Kennedy, but he still fitted the role very well, and he was so pleasant to work with.
Yes, he was a lovely man. Bert Newton once, in my occasional chats with Bert referred to him as a gentle giant.
That's right, I think he used that term at his funeral. Bert spoke very nicely at Jeff's funeral.
Yes, and as a matter of interest, that's where I met Philip, who was also at the funeral, which led to me coming in and being in the position I'm in at 3AW today.
Well, that's very interesting. I know the church was that crowded, or wherever it was, I don't recall, but I know that I desperately needed a seat, and I couldn't find one.
Which is always a good thing. I'm hoping for the same when it comes to my turn.
Well, here I am at 90, never dreaming that I would still be doing appearances. But I found that there's a nostalgic need of people over 50, and the requests come in when a little newspaper article appeared on my 90th birthday, and so I'm pleased that I'm able to go to these places, Provis, Rotary, age retreats and so forth, and give a nostalgic illustrated with audio visuals talk and do 10 minutes of ventriloquism at the finish. And it's a joy to get the questions and to be able to answer them at my age.
Well, was there ever a time at all? Because let's go back to where the first time you actually became a ventriloquist, or the first time the idea entered your head. How old would you have been?
I was 7 years of age. My father started the Boy Scout movement in Australia, with Brunswick being #1 troop, and in the course of his work, when he left the bank to take up this role, we were in West Australia, and at a boys' home at Gosnells in Western Australia, there was an annual fete of craft work, and performing in a band rotunda was a Professor Turner. I knew that was his name because it was written on a trunk beside him, and that was the first time I'd seen a ventriloquist, and as the doll went into the trunk beside him, the voice faded, and I could hear the doll calling from inside, apparently, "Let me out, let me out." Now, in the course of my career, I got appointed in charge of live television in Perth, and grandchildren of Professor Turner gave me the dolls that he'd used, and the main doll, which was my motivation to becoming a ventriloquist, is now in the Performing Arts Museum in Melbourne.
Did the doll have a name?
He is Sailor Jim.
Sorry, what was it?
Sailor Jim.
Sailor Jim.
Yes, and that is a treasured piece in the Performing Arts Museum. So that was the catalyst, but my dad didn't know anything about ventriloquism. He told me the fellow was a ventriloquist, and at 7 years of age, where did you go? But at 14, I was back in Melbourne and was able to go to the public library and get books on it, with my grandma eventually paying the £5 for a doll from Will Andrade's Magic Shop at 52 Swanson Street, Melbourne. And in the last few years, I was doing a show at the White Horse Library, and in the audience was Will Andrade at 90-odd years of age.
Oh, how amazing.
Yeah, it was great.
Did you get a chance to catch up and have a chat?
Oh, very much so. And he was so thrilled about it that it was a delight that I could do it. And I'd had no contact or heard of him in all those years before, because he wasn't a performer, and the shop was sold. Will Andrade's was quite a famous shop, and somebody else bought it and had a stall in Alan's music shop under the name of Andrade's.
Wow. Had he followed your career? Had he kept an interest and known who you
I
were?
suppose he couldn't help but have seen it, because in the days of Channel 9 and television being new, you had press write-ups every day, naturally, because it was such a new thing and the public were entranced with it all. So he had, but he was not interested in show business, but he was so thrilled to be there and meet me, and I him.
I was going to say, if I was the man who sold Ron Blaskett his first ventriloquist doll, I'd be telling the world on a daily basis.
I suppose it's a little different when your career's taken another course.
Yes.
And I was a kid then, and he may not have even associated the fact that he sold me that first doll.
But it's fabulous that you remember. Did that doll have a name?
Yes, it was Willie Ross, named after a man, J. Hallett Ross, who did radio programs on the ABC, and I'd had contact with him, and he taught elocution, voice production, Melbourne University lecturer, and that's how the name Willie Ross came about for my first figure.
And that would have been, we're talking 30s into maybe early 40s there, would it be?
Yes, right through the war I used that figure, and Jerry G was only flown out for the opening of Channel 9, hence the name Jerry G of GTV, alliterative and easy to remember.
Ah, so that was the literal, that's where the idea came from to call him Jerry G?
Yes, from GTV, in association with Norm Spencer, the program manager, we came up with that name, and what a beauty it was. It sort of stuck and caught on, and the Jerry G. Tarrax Club, of course, was huge. And in 1 year, we raised money for 5 vans for what was the Spastic Children's Society in those days. I think it's called Scope nowadays.
Scope, yes, that's right, yes. Now, before we get into all the television era, I'd love to go back and find out, having the interest from the age of 7 and your first doll at 14, the doll or puppet? I never quite know what to say.
Well, as a puppet is usually run by strings. It's a ventriloquist figure.
Ah, okay. Well, yes, having your first ventriloquist figure at the age of 14, were you also, were there other hobbies? Were you a run-of-the-mill sort of footy-loving, go out and bash a cricket ball around with a bat sort of kid?
No, but I was very interested in model aeroplanes. In those days, you only had rubber-powered internal combustion engines for model aeroplanes were just coming in, and so I made model aeroplanes from balsa wood and tissue covering. That was a hobby, but I was absolutely wrapped in show business, and every opportunity to see a performer I would take, including paying 1 and a penny to go up in the gods at the Tivoli and watch various performers.
Did you see at the Tivoli, would many of international ventriloquists have
Not many,
made
an occasional one. Clifford Guest, the great Australian, came back from a successful season in London, and he was one of the greatest, and he worked for 40 years in America with management by the William Morris Agency, a famous theatrical agency. But from the age of 14, I entered telequests with Hoyts. They would run them to fill up the time before the second feature film, and I started to win a number of those. One I can recall was at the Plaza Coffee Lounge at St Kilda, and it was compared by John McMahon, a great radio personality and a singer, whose version of Stardust was remarkable. And that gave me money and also experience, and I then added a second doll modelled on Disney's Goofy Dog, and working 2 dolls at the same time certainly gave me lots and lots of work. And I got into radio doing Friday nights with Norman Banks, a famous Melbourne man who was the king of radio in Melbourne at that time. The show was called Victory Varieties. Margot Sheridan was the pianist, and I was fortunate enough to be able to take her into television.
Now, I'm always intrigued by the idea of a ventriloquist act working on radio, because it sounds sort of unusual. Because
it sounds unusual, but when you consider it, the figure has to be entirely different to the ventriloquist. What's the difference between Abbott and Costello, Philip Brady and Simon Owens,
yes,
Ron Blaskett and Jerry G? They think differently. There's a dichotomy of the brain. Jerry G would say things that I would never say if I was working solo on radio. So it's two distinct people so far as the listening audience is concerned. And many years ago in the 30s, at the station that you're on now, there was a famous team called Mel Verco and Ginger, working with Bruce Mansfield's uncle, Terry Deer.
Yes.
And it was a very successful quarter of an hour, and it was straight ventriloquism. Mel didn't talk much. He didn't have such a good talking voice, but his dog Ginger had a falsetto voice, so it was distinctive and very good radio.
How interesting.
Yeah, and I was lucky enough in wartime to eventually get into army concert parties with Peter Finch, Horry Dargy, the world-class harmonica player, and all the musicians of the ABC military age. And I had Smokey Dawson with me, Max Reddy, Helen Reddy's father, and eventually I got my own show, kept Smokey Dawson in it. We supported Gracie Fields on a South Pacific tour and finished the war in Borneo.
How amazing.
Yeah, it was good. I mean, much better than shooting people.
Well, yes, true. Ron Blaskett is our special guest this morning. We'll be back with more after the Friday night. So your first radio show was that Friday nights with Norman Banks?
It probably wasn't the first. I think the first was a midnight amateur hour with Jack Clemenger, the father of John Clemenger, the advertising man. And I can remember him having the acetate disc and brushing all the stuff off it. It's got a special name, and that was put to air at a later time. That was probably the first of radio, but then I started to get good radio spots, and at the time of going into military service, I was doing regular spots.
Okay, and did you chop and change around stations much, or...?
Not a great deal. ABC were very good using variety artists on a Saturday night, a lot of that before and after the war, but not chopping and changing. It was only in later years that I had the contract to do a lot of radio work, particularly filling in for Bert Newton. Every 8 weeks he had a holiday in about 78, 79 on UZ.
Right. Now, back in the 50s, in the lead up to television, with all that radio experience, were you doing appearances at different venues as well?
Oh, well, I did the Tivoli immediately after the war,
yeah,
and that was the mecca of every Australian artist. To get on the Tivoli really meant something. And I played Tivoli, and then you got all the work about the place. So I was making very good money and was quite experienced, and luckily Harold Stone booked me to do closed-circuit demonstrations. That was compared by Eric Pierce and a lady who married Paul Fitzgerald, the artist, Mary Parker, her name was, and we did closed-circuit demos at the showgrounds. So I was experienced in that way, but I studied up on it very much, and I got loads of material already.
Yeah. Were your radio gigs always you doing a ventriloquist act, so with Willie Ross, or...? Yes,
with Willie Ross and Adolphus Twerk, the country bumpkin, and usually a straight man, which would be the announcer. And then I had a long series with Peter's pals from the 3XY, and a lady called Sally used to compare that, and Jeff Hale was the musical conductor.
But there wasn't any times where it was just yourself, just Ron Blaskett appearing solo?
Oh, heavens no, I don't think anyone would be interested in that. No.
All right. Now, as we head toward television, how did your involvement in television come about? Was it a natural extension of when television started, they used the radio talent that was around?
No, I don't think so. I got ready, as I said, for television, and I was well placed with 20 years' experience under my belt. But I did a show in Collins Street at a men's night, and they didn't have a stage, they had a big table. But they were men in a particularly jolly mood, and Norm Spencer was in the audience, and he saw me go particularly well, and I think that was the catalyst for him using me in the closed circuit, and phoning me immediately got back from America, having seen Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, Candice Bergen's father, having seen them work, and he was the first to phone me and tell me, I want you for the kid show. I said, yes, one night a week. He said, no, 5. Well, after I picked myself up from the floor, he said, you'll be right, you'll be working with Nicky. And what happened? Nicky died before we opened, and that's how the great Happy Hammond got his chance in television.
And that show was the show that went on to be the Tarak show, wasn't it?
Yes, it started as the Happy show. Happy left us because he wasn't under contract in 1960. I couldn't go because I had 2 years to run on contract. Happy never forgave me for that, but I couldn't do it because the contract would have been terrible legal troubles. But I'm sorry I didn't go because Norm had gone there when the Packers took over, and I would have liked to have been able to go.
Right. Now, so we're at GTV. So how long were you at Channel 9 for? And was it mainly the Tarak show, or were there other?
No, every Friday night I appeared on IMT, particularly doing an ad for LP Alexander with a little man tapped on the window. And that little figure finished up in the Block Arcade in a chocolate shop after being rescued from a rubbish tip in Perth. But apart from that, I did the BP Super Show, various other shows, with my wife particularly working a girl figure, and having the theatre experience, I was sort of used to that. But then eventually I produced the first decimal currency show with Franklin, the hypnotist, who was a very good hypnotist, but not a very good television personality. It was called Double Your Dollars.
Now I haven't heard of that one. A decimal currency.
It's a young Simon,
I know, but all those years listening to Bruce and Phil, you'd think I would have picked up some more.
Yes, well, W dollars being the first decimal currency quiz, it was earmarked, and it was sponsored by Shell.
Okay. Was that in any way supposed to be educational to help people around the conversion to decimal currency?
A little of that in it, but using the dollars sort of got them familiar with it. And together with a huge campaign that was running to familiarise people with it, it was okay, but unfortunately Franklin was not a television type.
Now, when the contract was up with Channel 9, what happened from there?
The contract wasn't up, but it was becoming increasingly clear that without Tarak's money around, they were bought by Schweppes, that there was no time, particularly with the Packers being the owners, for a very expensive television show, and I could see the writing on the wall, and I was not sacked by 9. I resigned and took up a job as radio and TV manager for Hughes Satchwell, the advertising agency that later on became a very big one, and I did that for about 8 months, and then I was called to Perth to be in charge of all live television, including news.
On Perth's equivalent of Channel 9?
Channel 9, yes, but we were unrelated in those days. In fact, they were more in partnership with 7 in those days. 9 was locally owned over in Perth.
So that was more a management type position, was it?
That's right, but I still didn't make the mistake of getting myself classed as a children's only entertainer. So I appeared in nightclubs in Perth, breaking the records of 17 months at one called the Nanking, a cabaret over there.
Well, because that was the other thing I was going to ask, is of course you would have had to have developed shows for very different audiences. I would imagine there'd be a large kids fan base for Jerry G and also quite an adult audience for Smoke Nights.
Yes, well, I didn't do Smoke Nights back here in that time, and I never had a meal in a hotel in that time, because Tarracks naturally were very protective of their image of soft drinks and so forth, and they were very good people and very good sponsors, the Pettard family. But I realised later on that I was getting tight, that no one knew me as anything but a children's entertainer. And after the pub scene got very big in Melbourne and I came back from Perth, my name would come up for shows and they said, oh no, we couldn't have him, he's for the kids. So I had to make sure that didn't happen, and for 7 years I worked the Sydney clubs, including 3 weeks at Eastern Suburbs with Don Wayne.
Okay. What years would we be looking at there?
Oh, you're getting into the 70s now.
Okay. And how was Don to work with?
Well, I can say it now. The 3 weeks I worked with him, Judy Stone, the singer, was the other performer, and an American comedian called Jerry Leader. He never spoke to any of us for the whole 3 weeks, not even a hello. And
Really?
I couldn't help noting the difference to Gracie Fields, who used to come down and thank us after every show during the war.
Oh.
Yeah, it was strange.
Oh, unusual. Okay.
Yeah, but anyway, we got paid and the shows went well, so didn't worry too much.
No, that's fair enough. In the 1970s, Sydney with Don Lane. So why the move to Sydney? Was it just the work was available
because
there?
there was more work there. You didn't have the clubs here, and there you had hundreds and hundreds of clubs with the poker machines, because we didn't have them here.
Yes.
So people used to go across the border, but around Sydney proper, you had clubs everywhere with shows with 3 and 4 artists in them, and a resident band. So there was a ton of work up there. So I commuted to and fro to Sydney.
Now, I've neglected to ask at this point, but by then, of course, you were married, children.
Oh, I'd been married well before television.
Yes.
I've been married 67 years. I was married during the war in 1944 to Merle, who's still with me now, and she is 87 years of age.
And so how did the family go with the moving from Melbourne to Perth, then to Sydney?
Well, Ronald, my eldest son, who's now 65 years of age, had to stay here because he was in advertising with Clemenger Harvey, and he worked with the famous Philip Adams, who you see still on television now and again. So he became creative director there, so he had to stay here, and Peter was a young guy, so he came to Perth and went to school there.
Did you keep in touch with old schoolmates and friends from that era?
I would have if they had still been alive. No, not a great deal, because there was the wartime bit, and of my concert party that I was in charge of at the end of the war, there's only one that I know is left, and that's Howard Vernon Knight. Howard Vernon, he worked under, a very good comedian. So I didn't keep in touch, and Smokey Dawson was very busy in other fields, so although I was best man at his wedding, we weren't close or in touch, no.
What about, again, I keep thinking of these things I missed when we were talking about your earlier life. It's at school. How were you at school? A good student? Bad? Always in trouble?
Average. I was at Swinburne Tech the last part of my education, and I was only an average student, but I was very much into reading bits about show business and radio fan and all that sort of thing. But probably the biggest experience I had was doing the Canada Expo in about 74, 75, and on the bill was Olivia Newton-John and Frank Sinatra. You never got to mix with them because you're in a different spot. But 3 million people a week went through on the shores of Lake Ontario, and that was a wonderful experience.
Wow.
And then I toured and went back to America in 1983 to work over there.
You say you never really sort of got to mix with Frank Sinatra. Did you ever have a conversation with him?
No, there was no hope of that.
Oh, right.
He always had a coterie of people around him, and there was never any hope, but I have got the cuttings to prove it.
That must have been a bizarre way to live a life like that for him.
Very strange, but I suppose any artist of that note has to be protected a little from the public and the other artists for that matter. So it was understandable.
All right. So now, so Sydney finishes up. That was in the 70s. So
yes, and then the scene blossomed in Melbourne, particularly the hotel scene. There were people working all over Melbourne in the freelance work, and there was a ton of that going on. From then on, I used television only as a shop window to sell from, and there was plenty of work available, fortunately, in Melbourne from then on. And I did all sorts of things for companies. For instance, I had about 5 years with the Dairy Corporation, and Peter Russell Clark, who's about to resurface on television, used to do the television shows, and I did all their live shows for the Dairy Corp.
Ah. And I didn't realise Mr. Russell Clark is on his way back, is he?
Well, he's been on some show that's coming up very shortly.
Oh, it'd be good to see him back on the screen.
Yeah, he was on the news a couple of weeks ago. He came over from overseas, and his house was burned down somewhere past the Geelong area. Oh. And they showed he and his wife looking at the remains of the home.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, well, you're always busy on air, aren't you?
Well, I know, but it's supposed to be my job to keep up with the news. That's an embarrassing admission to make.
Yes, well, there is promos currently on, and a brief flash of him doing cooking in a show that's coming up.
Now, in your 90 years, of which you've wanted to be and were a ventriloquist for 83 of those years, was there ever a time where you thought, I might just give it all away and chase, become an accountant or something like that?
Never, no. Because fortunately there was always progressive work and progressive challenges. And when the Theatre Royal opened in Brisbane with George Wallace Jr., my wife and I worked an act, and in it we would swap dolls at the finish, but they would talk with the same voice. Now you can imagine the practice that took, particularly singing, because I had to animate for her, she had to supply the voice, and vice versa.
Oh, that would be a nightmare to try and master.
Well, it was a knockout piece of work, and we did that on the BP Super Show with Bob Dyer. Bob Dyer came out with a show called The Marcus Show to the Princess Theatre and did his hillbilly act. But a lot of people don't know that he became a vocalist with Jim Davidson's orchestra. And he was a straight vocalist for many years, and then he developed the pick-a-box routine, which was on radio first and then on television later, and revived by Bert and Patty Newton.
I didn't know. I remember Bert and Patty doing it. No, I wasn't.
Well, by permission from Bob.
Oh, lovely. Now, did you ever find that there were waves where it was trendy to love a ventriloquist act, but then not so much, where people might have thought, with modern technology it was a bit old hat, and then it became trendy again? Have you ever noticed sort of ebbs and flows of
I haven't,
demand?
Because I've always been able to entertain any audience under any circumstances. So I was able, through experience, to entertain under any conditions. But I suppose with young people, if they thought it was daggy, we've had fellows like David Strassman coming out regularly, and
yes,
coming out again later in the year, and he's brought it into this century by using radio control for the movements and so forth. And smart young man, he's made a lot of money in Australia.
He has. He's done very well for himself.
Yeah.
Have you met him?
No, but I did a critique about him, and he phoned in regard to it for John Plain on the ABC.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, but my second son, Peter, who's an optician, he is at the cutting edge of Melbourne work, and working with all sorts of sports people and well-known people, Sam Kekovich and people like that you know of.
Yeah.
My eldest son, Ronald, is a booking agent, and he books Peter around the place, and he can make more on a Saturday night than he does as a week as a manager of an optical firm called the Spectacle Site up at Boronia.
Oh, okay. Now, a question I have is, now I've heard it said, and you're the one person who'd be able to verify this, these days merchandising is such a big thing in movies and television, where you go out and buy a Harry Potter lunchbox and colouring book and all that sort of thing. I heard it said once that the very first merchandising we effectively had here in Melbourne with television was the Jerry G dolls.
That's quite correct. The Jerry G. Jr. doll by the L.J. Stern Doll Company, and that is verified in a book by people called Fainges, Fainges, about dolls and doll manufacture. And the L.J. Stern Doll Company in Leicester Street, Carlton, made Jerry G. Juniors over a number of years, and that was the first marketing bit for television, and successful for many, many years. And we had various forms. We had Jerry G. hand puppets, Jerry G. barrackers, which were a flat face with a moving mouth, and football colours on the bowl. And now the Jerry G. Jr. dolls, if they're in their original box, fetch about $2,000 at auction.
Well, I tell you, he'll be very pleased to hear that. That is David Mann, our promotion and marketing manager here at 3AW.
I know David, and good cheerio to him. He's got one, has he?
He has. He's got one, and it's still in its box.
I wished I had kept a room full of them. I would have been very wealthy.
Now, the Jerry G. Jr. dolls, now, how did they come about? Did you approach the company to make them, or did they approach you?
I met Leo Stern, who was a refugee just before Hitler's era, and all his money went. But Morris Ashkenazi, a QC, staked him to make papier-mâché bride dolls, and you had to get permits to make them in those days. So he made bride dolls, and I approached him to see if he could make a reproduction in miniature of Jerry G. And he called them Jerry G. Juniors, and I wrote up the marketing campaign. Jerry G. Jr. from L.J. Stern is easier to handle and easier to learn. Wrote the little books, and with GDB9 giving us free adverts every night, and a ticket was put in which entitled them to apply to come into the audience for the Jerry G. Tarax Club.
How wonderful. Well, David Mann said that he had been in the audience, so I assume that's exactly what happened in his situation.
I guess so. Oh, good on him.
We are with Ron Blaskett, and we'll be back with more after this. Also, a female doll. Was that Geraldine, or was it,
yes,
or is that an urban myth?
Geraldine, but that was not the name of my wife's doll. Her doll's name was Sandra Simpkins, but Geraldine G. was, for the feminine purchases, a sister of Jerry G. Jr., but she only appeared as a junior doll on the Tarax show, not as a performance doll.
Okay. They were sold probably not quite as well as the Jerry G's, but probably
not
quite a few.
Not quite as many, but Myers had a huge sale of them. They were always ringing up Leo and asking him to send more, and various models were brought out, including the Beatles and Spacemen and all that sort of thing. And we made sure that we kept the interest of the public up in the Jerry G. Jr. dolls.
Those Beatles ones would be interesting to see nowadays.
Yes.
I'd imagine they'd fetch a pretty penny on both markets.
I guess they would. You see them come up now and again. Friends tell me that they're on eBay. I haven't got that sort of thing. I don't need it at my age, but they tell me they come up quite often for sale on eBay.
Now, in your 14, you got your first doll, so the first ventriloquist puppet, was it? No.
The figure. Puppets will do, though, but puppets are the string ones.
Yes. Well, having got your first one at 14 and now aged 90, as you've said, in your 76 years, what would be the greatest career achievement? The thing that you stand proudly and say, I did that?
Well, there was success in television, but I must confess I expected to be successful in television, which might sound a bit rude, but I did. But I think the greatest achievement was getting on the Tivoli Theatre as an Australian artist.
Yes.
That was huge. The biggest thing in television was promoting that we would be at the zoo and having 26,000 turn up there, children and adults, and it took the gardens at the zoo 6 months to recover from that onset. But that was so early in television in 57 that's when I realised the power of this new medium and how big it was going to be.
That is remarkable.
Yes.
Would there be a low point, something that you wish that you hadn't done, or...
Well, as I said, Simon, the low point was probably that I was not able to go to Channel 7 with Happy.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have been able to do that, particularly as Norm Spencer had been so good to me. But no, I must say it's been a very rewarding thing, and more so now when I find there's still a demand and I'm getting reaction at my age. Not for any reimbursement, because we do these shows and only cover our expenses for our sound systems and all that. But it is remarkable to find that there's still people who are interested, particularly in the nostalgia when they're over 50.
Yes.
And my book, of course, has been a highlight. If you haven't got one, I'll be happy to send you one.
Oh, no, I got one very early on.
Oh, good on you.
Fabulous piece, yes. That's still available, is it?
Oh, yes.
And so the book is called You, Me and Jerry G.
That's correct, yes.
Where would people get hold of that?
Oh, well, it's only sold privately, because the bookshops, you've seen them going bung everywhere. You pay freight to put them in, and then you've got to wait months for your money and pay to take them out. But my son's in the phone book and readily available, and they're available from him. And of course, at these shows I'm doing, we have merchandise available. And Bob Phillips, the producer of Channel 9, has put out a DVD, a tribute to Ron Blaskett, which is available too.
Oh, excellent. I'll also look up, now which son is it, because you've got the two?
Young Ron is 65.
Ron Jr.
Ron Jr. and Peter is the 53-year-old.
Excellent. Oh, now, one or two last little off-the-wall sort of questions. Was there, we asked about the achievement and low point, was there ever an embarrassing moment where things just went completely and utterly wrong, set fell down, or Jerry's head fell off?
Very much so. In the Ernie Sigley show, which Ernie had seen me working at Footscray, he was a supporter there at a footy night where I went particularly well, and he wanted me for his show. I did the show, and in rehearsal, I had Jerry G with a junior on the front of him, and he became a ventriloquist, which required a lot of aligning of the controls to go inside Jerry G's tummy. And in rehearsal, everything worked fine. But on the night, the floor manager decided to grab the doll from me and put it under Ernie's desk and misaligned all the mechanism. And I had to ad-lib my way out of trouble when I got it back and realised that things were awry. So, watching the tape, which I have of it now, I got out of trouble very well, but it was a very tense and embarrassing moment.
How funny! And Ernie would have loved it, I assume.
Oh yes, well, I finished up turning Ernie into the doll, pressing on the back of his neck and making him move his mouth and supplying the voice for him.
Oh, that's good.
A good sport, though. He was very good like that.
Yes. Now, who do you admire the most out of all the people you've worked with, or even people you haven't worked with? Is there somebody you've always just thought was fabulous?
Oh, Gracie Fields, the English film star.
Yes.
Far and away the best of the people. And so far as the ventriloquist is concerned, the Australian Clifford Guest, who did so well in America. And I've also very much admired a man called Senor Wences. You mightn't have heard of him, but he's a man who turned his hand into a face and had a little body under it. And he worked the big theatres of the world till he was 100 years of age.
Oh, wow.
The thumb, when he clenched the fist, the thumb became a moving jaw.
Yes.
And he put on two eyes on the knuckles.
Yes.
And the hair and the body underneath a flat cardboard. A remarkable act. And he was out here when Danny Kaye played the Princess Theatre and supported Danny Kaye.
I've seen that sort of thing done many times, but he was the original, was he?
He was the one. Oh, yes, he was a genius.
Now, what makes you angry? Is there anything that really annoys you?
Not really.
No?
Perhaps the thing I dislike most is the fact that young people are losing their liking of what is music, and they're going for noise. Modern alleged music it just doesn't cut it for me.
Yes.
And when I see kids going and paying big money for a concert and screaming all through the performer, I think, well, what's the point? And is this performer going to be known like Mozart, Beethoven, etc., 100, 200, 300 years? And it's a pity that they've lacked their discernment of what is music, and they're going for noise.
Yes, so look, I have 4 children, so I do know what you're talking about, because some of the stuff they...
Well, you don't find it hard to be heard, would you?
Oh, it does get difficult. Although I do tend to think that out of all the music that is ever released, only a handful of songs from each week, month, whatever, are remembered, and they generally do end up being the ones that stand out as being the better ones, as opposed to the rubbish that just gets churned out.
That's right.
It tends to be forgotten fairly quickly.
Yes, and the bizarre dressing and behaviour and so on, I can't for the life of me understand how some of these fellows who are multi-millionaires and prance and rant all over the stage make so much money and become so successful. But there's a market for it, obviously, and I'm an old fogey out of touch with that sort of thing. But I love good, listenable music.
Well, look, you have been very generous with your time. I'm ever so grateful you agreed to have a chat to me. I've enjoyed it very much. Now, is there anything we didn't cover? Because I've tried to sort of make sure everything was covered, and you're just a dream guest.
No, but I'm enjoying life very much, but particularly having a great-granddaughter whose name is Harper Rose, named after Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah.
She's a delight at 2 years of age, and her mother, my granddaughter, is Butte, and I've got 2 other granddaughters, one working as a paramedic nurse at Royal Melbourne, and the other one is just about to shift to Torquay. So I have a delight with the family in the pleasant times when the family are all together for a special occasion.
Well, Ron Blaskett, thank you very much again for your time. It has just been fabulous.
It's great to talk to you, Simon, and we'll try and get a DVD to you that you obviously haven't seen.
Yes, I'd love to see that. Thank you.
Good luck with your work.
Good on you, Ron.
Bye for now.
Ron Blaskett.